The Arizona sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dusty plains. John Mercer, a rugged rancher in his 40s, guided his horse along the uneven trail near the edge of his land. He had spent his life tending cattle, repairing fences, and surviving the harsh frontier. The wide open land was both beautiful and dangerous, a place where every sound could mean trouble. That evening, the air was unusually still. The only noises were the soft crunch of his horse's hooves on the dirt and the occasional call of a distant bird. John had ridden this trail many times before, but tonight, a strange feeling made him uneasy. Something about the stillness did not feel natural. As he rounded a bend near a narrow canyon, John noticed a figure hanging from a tree. At first he thought it was a trick of the shadows, but as he drew closer his heart froze. It was a young girl, barely 15, tied with ropes that cut into her small wrists and ankles. Her face was pale, her eyes closed, and she swayed slightly in the wind. John's instincts kicked in. He spurred his horse forward and pulled his knife from his belt. Carefully he approached the girl. He could see the bruises on her arms and the rope marks on her neck. "By God," he whispered. "She's barely alive." He dismounted and knelt beside her. His hand shook slightly as he cut the ropes. The girl collapsed into his arms, weak and trembling. John held her gently. "It's all right. You're safe now," he said softly. She opened her eyes slowly, fear and confusion mixing in her gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. John's mind raced. He was alone, miles from the nearest town. Bringing her to safety meant risking danger, but he could not leave her to die. He lifted her carefully and carried her to his horse. With one arm supporting her, he guided his horse back toward his cabin, making sure she was secure. As they rode, John noticed the girl shivering despite the warm evening air. "You're cold," he said. "We'll get you inside and warm you up." The girl nodded, glancing around nervously. She said nothing about how she ended up in that tree. John decided it was best not to press her yet. Some things were better revealed in trust. By the time they reached the cabin, night had fallen. The wooden structure sat alone on the edge of the prairie, surrounded by tall cacti and the distant mountains. John lit a lantern and carried the girl inside. He laid her gently on a clean blanket. The warmth of the small fireplace slowly reached her, and she began to relax slightly. John went to the cupboard and fetched water and some bread. "Here, drink this," he said. The girl took the water hesitantly and sipped slowly. Her hands were small and fragile and her movements cautious. John studied her quietly. She wore simple clothing, worn and torn from travel or struggle. He could see she had endured much pain. "What's your name?" John asked finally. "Little Dove," she replied softly. Her accent was thick, broken English that John could understand with effort. "Little Dove. All right," he said, trying to keep his voice calm and steady. "I'm John Mercer. You're safe here. No one can hurt you inside this cabin." Little Dove's eyes filled with tears, and she lowered her head. John could tell she had learned quickly that not all men were kind. Her trust had been earned slowly, if at all. He did not press further. Instead, he stoked the fire and began to prepare a small meal, careful not to startle her. Over the next few hours, Little Dove gradually regained some strength. She drank more water and nibbled at the bread John had offered. He asked gentle questions about her journey, but her answers were short, cautious, and sometimes hesitant. She spoke of other groups, of fear, and of her family, but John noticed she avoided details about who had tied her or why. As he worked, John's mind could not help but wander to the dangers of the frontier. Many conflicts had occurred between settlers and Apache tribes, and tensions often flared with little warning. Yet despite knowing the risks, John felt no hesitation in helping her. It was instinct, a mixture of compassion and honor. Night deepened outside the cabin. The wind howled faintly through the cracks in the wooden walls, and the stars shone bright in the desert sky. John kept watch over Little Dove, ensuring she remained safe. Occasionally, she would stir in her sleep, muttering softly in her native language. John listened quietly, careful not to wake her. He thought about the strange turn of events. Who had left a child hanging in the canyon? Was it a random act of cruelty or part of something more? John could not be sure, but one thing was clear. He had acted without hesitation, saving a life when he could have walked away. That thought gave him a quiet sense of pride. By midnight, Little Dove slept more peacefully. John settled near the fire, rifle close by, and allowed himself a brief moment of rest. He had saved her life, but the vast, dangerous land around him reminded him that danger was never far. The frontier was unpredictable, and survival often depended on courage, quick thinking, and sometimes pure luck. As John drifted into a light sleep, he could not shake a small sense of unease. Something about the girl, her sudden appearance and her quiet eyes made him cautious, yet he pushed the thought aside. For now she was safe, and that was what mattered. Outside, the desert remained silent, but the shadows seemed longer, darker. Unseen eyes watched the cabin from a distance, and the quiet wind carried whispers of secrets yet to be revealed. John had saved a life, but he could not know that the events of that night would mark the beginning of a dangerous and unpredictable journey, one that would test not only his courage but his trust in the people he helped. For John Mercer, the night was both a victory and a warning, a reminder that even in acts of kindness, the frontier held surprises, and that safety was never guaranteed. Little Dove had been rescued, but the story was far from over. The morning sun spilled through the small windows of John Mercer's cabin, filling the room with soft golden light. Little Dove was already awake, sitting quietly on the blanket where John had placed her the night before. Her eyes were wide and alert, scanning the room with a mixture of curiosity and caution. John stirred some coffee over the small stove, the aroma filling the cabin. "Morning," he said gently. "Did you sleep well?" Little Dove nodded slowly, but she did not speak. She seemed wary, as if every sound, every movement might be a threat. John understood. Life for her had been hard, full of fear and danger. He wanted to make her feel safe, even if it was only a little. "Eat some bread," John said, placing a small plate in front of her. "It will give you strength." She looked at the food, then back at him, before picking up a piece and nibbling carefully. John noticed how delicate her movements were, how she seemed unused to regular meals. It reminded him of the dangers she must have faced, living in the wild or escaping from people who meant to hurt her. After breakfast, John decided it was time to clean her wounds properly. He had some basic supplies and disinfectant, and he wanted to make sure she healed quickly. Little Dove allowed him to work, though she flinched at the touch of the sore spots. "Your arms are badly bruised," John said, "but they will heal. You need rest and food, and soon you'll be strong again." Little Dove said nothing, only letting her dark eyes meet his. There was a silent understanding between them. He had saved her life, and she knew it. Yet she also carried a quiet tension, like a shadow following her. John sensed it, though he could not place it. As the morning turned into afternoon, John worked on repairing some broken fence posts near the cabin. Little Dove followed at a distance, watching him carefully. Every so often she would speak in her soft voice, asking questions about the land, the horses, and the ranch. John answered patiently, trying to build trust. "You live here alone?" she asked, tilting her head. "Yes," John replied. "I've always lived here. It's quiet and it's my home, but sometimes quiet can be dangerous too." Little Dove nodded, her eyes scanning the surrounding hills. John noticed her looking toward the mountains where the trees formed dark shadows. She seemed almost aware of something he could not see. Her movements were careful, measured. She was more alert than a typical girl her age, and that made John both impressed and uneasy. That evening, John decided to make a small fire outside. He wanted Little Dove to feel safe and comfortable. The warm glow of the flames reflected in her dark eyes as she sat near him, listening to the sounds of the desert. Crickets chirped, and the wind rustled the dry leaves of distant trees. It was peaceful, but John could not shake the feeling that danger was nearby. "You must be tired," he said. "You've been through a lot." Little Dove nodded again, this time speaking. They wanted to hurt me. My family." Her voice trembled. She stopped abruptly, as if afraid to say more. John put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Shh," he said. "You're safe now. No one can touch you here." She glanced up at him, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes, but it was mixed with fear. John realized that this fear had been with her all her life. It would not leave easily. As the night grew darker, Little Dove stayed by the fire, but John noticed her glancing toward the distant hills repeatedly. Something about her behavior felt strange. She did not look like a normal girl lost in the wilderness. Her alertness, the way she listened to the slightest sound, and the careful way she moved. It all seemed deliberate, almost practiced. John tried to dismiss the thought. He had saved a life, and for now that was enough. But deep down, a small seed of unease had been planted. Over the next few days, John taught Little Dove small chores around the cabin. She fetched water from the nearby stream, helped feed the horses, and learned to gather firewood. She was quick and intelligent, picking up tasks faster than he expected. But John also noticed that she often paused, looking toward the horizon or listening for sounds beyond his cabin. One afternoon, while repairing the fence, John asked, "Why were you left hanging in the canyon? Who did this to you?" Little Dove's eyes widened slightly and she shook her head. I do not know," she whispered. Her tone was careful, almost rehearsed. John sensed she was hiding something, but he did not push. Some truths could only come out in time. That night, as John sat by the fire, he realized how much he had come to care for the girl. He had saved her life, and now he felt responsible for her safety. But he also felt a strange tension he could not ignore. Little Dove's quiet glances toward the hills, the way she sometimes whispered to herself, and her careful movements made him wonder if all was as it seemed. Despite these doubts, John remained patient. He knew the frontier demanded caution, but it also demanded kindness. He could not turn his back on someone in need, even if it meant risking his own safety. Little Dove's presence brought a mix of emotions: gratitude, suspicion, and a strange sense of wonder. She had survived something terrible, and now she was in his care. But John could not shake the feeling that she was not entirely innocent, that there might be more to her story than she revealed. As the days passed, their bond grew. Little Dove began to trust John, though carefully. She helped with small chores and listened when he spoke of his life, his ranch, and the dangers of the land. John, in turn, remained vigilant, knowing that even the kindest act could have consequences in this unpredictable land. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, John noticed a subtle change in Little Dove. She seemed calmer, more relaxed, yet her eyes still darted to the shadows beyond the cabin. John's instincts, honed by years on the frontier, whispered that he should remain alert. "Rest well tonight," he said. "Tomorrow we will go to the stream and gather water together. It will be easier if we work as a team." Little Dove nodded, but John caught a fleeting expression, a mixture of calculation and observation, that made him pause. Something about her behavior suggested that she was aware of more than she let on. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, John sat quietly, thinking about the strange events of the past days. He had saved a life, yes, but he also knew that the frontier was full of surprises, and not everyone was as they appeared. Little Dove was alive because of him, but he could not yet be sure of her intentions or what dangers might lie ahead. Outside, the desert was silent, but the shadows seemed to stretch closer to the cabin. John Mercer, experienced rancher and survivor of many dangers, realized that the calm was only temporary. Little Dove's presence had brought safety to one life, but it had also brought uncertainty and possibly danger into his home. The morning air was crisp and the sun had barely risen when John Mercer stepped outside his cabin. The desert stretched endlessly before him, a mixture of sand, rocks, and distant mountains. He could hear the faint rustle of the wind through the dry shrubs and the occasional call of a bird waking from the night. Yet, despite the calm, John's instincts told him to remain alert. Something about Little Dove's behavior over the past days had made him uneasy, and his gut told him that not everything was as it seemed. Little Dove appeared at the cabin door, carrying a small bundle of firewood. She moved gracefully, yet John noticed she glanced toward the hills more than once. Her alert eyes scanned the horizon as if expecting something or someone. John called out, trying to sound casual. "Good morning, Little Dove. Did you sleep well?" She nodded, giving a small, polite smile, but her attention never fully left the surrounding landscape. John noticed it, but he forced himself to remain calm. Trust was a tricky thing on the frontier, and he had learned that it could not be rushed. After breakfast, John decided to inspect his cattle. He knew that wandering near the canyon where he had found Little Dove could be risky, but he needed to ensure the livestock were safe. He gestured for her to stay at the cabin. "Stay here and keep watch," he said. "The cattle are nearby, but I won't be long." Little Dove nodded, though there was a faint hesitation in her movements. She seemed eager to follow him, but held back. John didn't push. He needed her to remain calm and safe while he worked. As he rode toward the grazing area, John's mind kept returning to the events of the past days. Little Dove had been through so much, yet her behavior was too careful, too controlled. She seemed almost trained. Her quiet observations, the way she measured every step, and her sudden silence in certain moments. It all added to a growing unease. By mid-morning, John had checked the cattle and found them unharmed. He was about to turn back when a flicker of movement caught his eye. In the shadows near the canyon, he thought he saw figures moving quickly, almost too swiftly for anyone to notice. He squinted against the bright sun, trying to make sense of what he saw, but the shadows shifted, and he could not be certain. Returning to the cabin, John found Little Dove at the doorway, her face calm, yet her eyes betrayed a subtle tension. She did not speak, only followed his movements as he approached. Something about her made John's unease grow stronger, though he could not explain why. That evening, as the sky turned orange and pink, John was preparing a small meal outside the cabin. The warmth of the fire contrasted sharply with the cool desert air. Little Dove sat nearby, helping with simple tasks, yet her eyes were constantly on the horizon, watching the shadows of the hills. Suddenly, John noticed a slight rustle behind a group of shrubs. He froze, instincts sharp, and reached for his rifle. From the darkness, several figures emerged silently, moving with precise steps. John's heart pounded. These were Apache warriors, and their numbers were more than he could easily handle alone. He realized immediately. The girl he had rescued, Little Dove, had been part of a trap. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. She had drawn him into a false sense of security, lured him into a vulnerable position, and now the attackers were here. John backed toward the cabin, keeping his rifle ready. He did not shout or panic. He had faced dangers before, and he knew that haste could cost him his life. The warriors spread around the cabin, surrounding him, their eyes fixed and unyielding. The wind carried faint whispers, almost like messages between them. Little Dove stood near the cabin door, calm and silent. John's anger and shock mixed with a flicker of sadness. He had saved her life, and yet her presence here now felt like betrayal. But he could not let his emotions control him. Survival came first. The first move came from the left. A warrior tried to rush the cabin, but John's quick reflexes and sharp aim stopped him. Bullets rang out, and the sound echoed through the canyon. John ducked behind the wooden walls, assessing his surroundings. Every movement of the attackers was careful and deliberate. They were well trained, and the realization made him respect their skill even as he fought for his life. Hours seemed to pass in a tense blur. John used the terrain to his advantage, moving between the cabin and nearby rocks to create diversions. He set small traps, logs balanced to topple, stones placed to create noise to confuse the attackers. Despite being outnumbered, John's experience on the ranch, his knowledge of the land, and his quick thinking kept him alive. From her position near the cabin, Little Dove watched silently. She did not intervene, and John realized that her calmness was part of the trap. Her presence had guided him into this dangerous moment. He could feel a mix of betrayal and frustration, but he pushed it aside. Survival required focus, not emotion. As the sun began to set, the warriors' attacks became less coordinated. John's clever use of the landscape, combined with his calm and calculated defense, forced them to retreat temporarily. He was exhausted, his arms sore, and his mind alert for any sudden move. But he had survived, and that small victory gave him the strength to continue. Night fell, and the desert grew quiet. The stars shone brightly, indifferent to the struggle below. John sat near the cabin, his rifle resting across his knees, catching his breath. Little Dove remained near the doorway, her eyes glinting faintly in the firelight. He did not speak to her, and she said nothing. The tension between them was unspoken but heavy. John realized that this was only the beginning. The trap had been clever, well-planned, and it had tested his instincts to the limit. He had survived, but he knew that Little Dove's true intentions were still a mystery. Her calmness, her watchful eyes, and the precise way she had appeared and disappeared during the attack, it all suggested there was more to come. The night was long and quiet, but John's mind remained alert. He could not fully trust the girl he had rescued, yet he could not turn her away either. The frontier was a place where danger lurked in every shadow, and trust had to be earned carefully. John Mercer had survived the first test, but he understood now that his journey with Little Dove would be filled with uncertainty, challenges, and moments that would demand every ounce of courage he possessed. The night was deep and cold, and the desert air pressed against John Mercer's cabin like an invisible weight. He could hear the faint rustle of the wind and the occasional distant howl of a coyote, but nothing else. He crouched near the cabin door, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the shadows. The Apache warriors could return at any moment. He knew he had survived the first attack, but survival in the frontier was never guaranteed. Little Dove sat silently near the fire, her eyes sharp and watchful. John noticed her glances toward the mountains where the dark shapes of the hills seemed to shift in the moonlight. Every instinct in his body told him she knew more than she admitted, but he had no time to dwell on betrayal. Right now he had to stay alive. The first movement came from the eastern ridge. Shadows shifted and John quickly aimed his rifle. A figure darted forward, attempting to get close to the cabin. John fired and the shot rang out across the desert. The figure fell and the others froze, reassessing their approach. He moved quietly to the side of the cabin, using the walls and rocks for cover. He set small traps with rocks and logs, hoping to confuse and slow the attackers. Each trap made a loud noise when triggered, forcing the warriors to pause. John's knowledge of the land and quick thinking gave him a chance to stay one step ahead. Hours passed and the standoff continued. The Apache warriors circled the cabin, testing John's defenses. They did not rush blindly. Every step was calculated, precise, and deliberate. John realized that this was more than a simple ambush. They were skilled fighters, trained and patient. But he had something they did not: intimate knowledge of his land. Every rock, every hill, every hidden path gave him an advantage if he could use it wisely. Little Dove remained near the doorway, silent but alert. John could see the flicker of emotion in her eyes: fear, curiosity, maybe even regret. He did not speak to her. There was no room for words now. Survival depended on focus, courage, and careful decisions. By midnight, John was exhausted. His arms ached, and his fingers were raw from holding the rifle. Yet he could not rest. The attackers had learned his tactics quickly, and he knew they would not give up easily. He had to find a way to force them back or escape if the situation became desperate. He studied the terrain and noticed a narrow path leading up the ridge. It was risky, but it might allow him to outflank the attackers. Quietly he moved toward it, staying low and hidden. Little Dove followed silently, her movements careful, almost instinctive. John realized she had learned something from watching him. She understood caution, observation, and timing. As they reached a small rise, John peeked over the edge. The warriors were spread out, some near the cabin, others further down the ridge. He counted their numbers and noted their positions. Then, using a combination of fire and noise, he created a diversion. Rocks tumbled down the slope, and a small flare of flame startled the warriors. Several ran toward the noise, thinking it was an opportunity to attack. But John and Little Dove were already moving along the hidden path. The diversion worked, and John led Little Dove to a safer position behind a large rock formation. From there, he could see the cabin and the surrounding area clearly. He realized he had bought only temporary safety. The warriors would regroup and he had to be ready for another round. Hours passed and exhaustion weighed heavily on both of them. John rationed their water and food carefully. He spoke to Little Dove quietly, giving instructions and encouraging her to stay calm. Despite her silence, she listened carefully, following his advice and learning from his actions. The moon rose high, casting silver light across the desert. Shadows shifted constantly and every movement could signal danger. John knew the warriors were patient. They would wait for an opportunity to strike. He needed a plan to turn the situation in his favor, to protect himself and Little Dove and possibly force the attackers to retreat. As dawn approached, the attackers became more cautious. John used this moment to move closer to the cabin, setting small traps and using rocks to make misleading sounds. He aimed to confuse them further, creating the illusion that he was everywhere at once. The strategy worked. The warriors became hesitant, unsure of his exact location. By mid-morning, the attackers finally retreated. They had underestimated John's knowledge, skill, and determination. He had survived the ambush not by chance, but by using every tool, skill, and instinct he had developed as a rancher and a man familiar with the dangers of the frontier. John returned to the cabin, exhausted but relieved. Little Dove followed closely, her expression unreadable. He did not confront her about the trap. There would be time for that later. For now, survival and safety were more important. The sun climbed higher, casting harsh light over the desert. John inspected the cabin, checking for damage and ensuring that no threats remained nearby. He found signs of movement around the edges, footprints, broken branches, and disturbed dirt, but no immediate danger. The warriors had gone, at least for now. Sitting near the fire, John finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. He looked at Little Dove, who was quiet, sitting on the blanket he had prepared for her. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, and he saw a flicker of something. Gratitude, perhaps, or understanding. He did not know what her intentions had been or why she had been involved in the trap, but he knew one thing for certain: they had survived together. John realized that this experience had changed him. He had acted with compassion, yet he had been tested in ways he could not have predicted. He had survived because of his skill, courage, and quick thinking, but he had also learned that trust could be dangerous. Little Dove had been part of the trap, yet she had not harmed him directly. Her role was still a mystery, and John knew it would remain so for some time. As the day wore on, John and Little Dove tended to the cabin and the small tasks that kept them alive. They moved cautiously, aware that the desert could hide dangers at any moment. The events of the night were still fresh in their minds, a reminder that the frontier was unpredictable and that survival required constant vigilance. By evening, John allowed himself a small sense of relief. They had survived the first attack, but he knew the danger was not over. The trap had been clever, well planned, and it had tested him to the limit. He had survived, but he would remain cautious, aware that the next challenge could come at any time. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, calm yet full of unseen threats. John Mercer, seasoned rancher and survivor of many dangers, understood that this was only one chapter of a larger story. Little Dove remained near him, quiet but watchful, and he realized that their journey together was far from over. The frontier was a land of beauty, danger, and unpredictability, and only those who combined skill, courage, and careful observation could survive. The morning sun rose slowly over the desert, painting the hills with a soft golden light. John Mercer sat on the wooden porch of his cabin, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him. He felt the weight of the past few days pressing on his shoulders: exhaustion, tension, and the lessons learned from a night that had tested every skill and instinct he possessed. Little Dove was quiet, tending to small chores near the cabin. She moved with care, her eyes scanning the horizon as she always did. John watched her carefully. Despite everything that had happened, she remained an enigma. Her presence had been a test, a lure into danger, yet she had also survived alongside him. He did not know if she had intended harm, or if her role in the trap had been forced by others, but he had no reason to suspect immediate danger from her now. John rose and walked slowly toward her. "We survived," he said softly. "That's something to be thankful for." Little Dove nodded, her dark eyes meeting his for a brief moment. There was no smile, no words of explanation, but a subtle acknowledgement of shared experience. They had faced danger together, and that bond, however fragile, had been formed in the desert night. Over the next few days, John took careful precautions. He reinforced the cabin, checked the surrounding area for signs of movement, and kept his rifle close. The attack had been a stark reminder that even the kindest actions could be exploited. Trust, he realized, was something that had to be measured, especially on the frontier. Little Dove helped where she could, though she remained cautious and distant. Her quiet presence reminded John of the night when he had found her, barely alive, and of the skill and calculation that had been involved in the trap. He wondered about her true story, what forces had brought her to the canyon, and why she had been part of a plan to lure him into danger. Despite his curiosity, John focused on the immediate. Survival and safety had been won, and the desert demanded respect. He taught Little Dove how to gather water efficiently, how to identify signs of approaching danger, and how to move silently across the land. She learned quickly, absorbing knowledge with a keen intelligence that impressed him. He could see that she was resilient, adaptable, and brave, qualities that had kept her alive until now. One afternoon, as they worked near the edge of the canyon, John paused and looked at her. "You've learned a lot in a short time," he said. "You're stronger than most people I know." Little Dove tilted her head, and for the first time she offered a small smile. It was brief, but it carried a weight of acknowledgement. John realized that trust, even if partial, was beginning to form between them. She had been cautious, even deceptive in her own way, but now she seemed willing to accept his guidance and protection. The days passed slowly. John reflected on the lessons of the past nights. He had acted with courage and compassion, and he had survived because of careful observation, quick thinking, and experience. Yet he knew that his compassion had also put him in danger. The frontier was not just a place of beauty and opportunity. It was a land where trust could be exploited, and where kindness could be mistaken for weakness. John spent time repairing fences, tending to cattle, and ensuring that the cabin was secure. Little Dove assisted where she could, and though she remained quiet, her presence was comforting. She had been a warning and a companion, a reminder that life on the frontier was unpredictable and that every action carried consequences. One evening, as the sun set and the sky glowed with orange and pink, John and Little Dove sat by a small fire outside the cabin. The desert was calm, almost peaceful, and for a moment the tension of the past days seemed to fade. John looked at her and spoke softly. "Life is hard here," he said. "The desert can be unforgiving, and people can be too. But you survived. And I survived. That means something." Little Dove nodded silently. She did not speak, but her eyes reflected understanding. John knew that their story would remain partially a mystery. He might never know her full reasons, her past, or why she had been part of the trap. Yet he had learned something important. Courage, intelligence, and careful observation could overcome even the most cunning plans. As night fell, John thought about the lessons of trust and vigilance. He had acted out of compassion, and though it had put him in danger, it had also allowed him to survive. Little Dove had been a challenge, a puzzle, and perhaps even a test, but she had also reminded him of the value of patience and careful judgment. The frontier demanded both courage and wisdom, and he had survived by balancing the two. In the following days, life at the cabin settled into a cautious routine. John continued to teach Little Dove survival skills, and she continued to follow his guidance. Though he never fully understood her motives, he respected her intelligence and adaptability. She had survived in harsh conditions before, and now she was learning to survive with him. John often thought back to the moment he had first seen her, hanging from the tree. That memory remained vivid, a mixture of fear, urgency, and compassion. He realized that the act of saving her life had changed both of them. It had tested his courage, judgment, and instincts in ways he had never expected. Though Little Dove's true intentions remained uncertain, John accepted that some mysteries of the frontier could never be fully solved. People could be cunning, danger could be hidden, and trust could be complicated. Yet he had survived, and in doing so, he had proven the value of skill, courage, and careful observation. By the end of the week, John stood on the porch, looking across the canyon toward the hills where the attack had first begun. The desert stretched endlessly, beautiful and unforgiving. Little Dove stood nearby, quiet and attentive, and he felt a sense of cautious optimism. They had survived a dangerous test together, and though the past could not be changed, the future offered opportunities to learn, adapt, and grow. John Mercer understood that life on the frontier was never simple. Acts of kindness could be dangerous and trust had to be measured carefully, but he also knew that courage, intelligence, and careful observation could overcome even the most cunning challenges. Little Dove remained a mystery, yet she was also a symbol of resilience, adaptability, and the unpredictable nature of life in the desert. As the sun dipped below the mountains and the sky turned a deep shade of purple, John allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He had faced danger, survived a trap, and learned important lessons about trust, compassion, and vigilance. The frontier remained unpredictable, but he felt ready to face whatever came next, equipped with knowledge, courage, and a deep understanding of the delicate balance between kindness and caution. Life continued at the cabin, calm but cautious. John knew that the desert held many secrets, some hidden and some yet to be revealed. Little Dove remained by his side, quiet and observant, and he accepted that some questions might never be answered. Yet he also knew that survival, courage, and careful judgment would always guide him through the challenges ahead. In the quiet of the desert night, with the stars shining brightly overhead, John Mercer reflected on the events that had brought them here. He had acted with compassion, faced danger, and survived a clever trap. The frontier had tested him, but he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware of the delicate balance between trust and caution. And as he watched Little Dove silently tending to her small tasks, he realized that sometimes survival was not just about strength or skill, it was about understanding, patience, and the courage to face the unknown with a steady heart.